is true for the people who reject the Tantra and think that they can develop this empty formalist religious system without any of the nasty parts. And they're both stupid, and they both don't get anywhere. They both don't get anywhere in different ways, but the result is ultimately, I think, the same, of nothingness and nihilism. And it's tricky because the nihilism of the Tantra only people is a little bit more obvious. But you and I have seen that when people just devote themselves to the empty formalism that the current OTO is heading towards, the nihilism is the same. I mean, it's the same crises, the same lurching from crisis to crisis, the same problems. So it ends up being nihilistic anyway, even if it's not immediately as apparent. But yeah, you have to have both, and you have to be able to balance them. And I don't criticize the OTO for being anything but out of balance. I mean, balance is the key word a lot of bourgeois occultists use to sort of create a safety place for themselves. And in fact, the current OTO, I think, is way out of balance. That it's gone over completely towards something that will make nice, comfortable, middle-class people feel safe and warm and give them what they want, which is a sense of serenity, a sense of peace. I don't know, you and I were talking about an article criticizing American Buddhists for what they wanted out of Buddhism, and it was a happy place. They wanted calm, they wanted serenity. That's not what religion is about. It's not giving you a happy place.
Nor is it what Buddhism is about. I mean, if you go and look at so many of the aspects that the Buddha set up and the rules of the Vijnana and everything, they're anything but happy-making. You can only eat from when you wake up in the morning till, noon. You can't eat after that. You can't do all of these other things. There are more than 400 restrictions put on a monastic Buddhist. That's not happy-making.
Well, it's not happy-making for people who don't want discipline. I mean, and then, again, we're back to this thing of, well, people want a party. Well, the 9-year-olds want ice cream. Does that mean we give it to them? No. And I would also argue, and I've been arguing, that the parties suck because everyone is so undisciplined and boring and unchallenging. If you want to have great parties, and I'm not opposed to having a great party, I think the great parties only happen when you have really smart, really intelligent, really well-disciplined people who study the material and are really enthusiastic about it. Those are the parties I want to go to. I don't want to go to a bunch of parties with fat, stupid, uneducated, not curious, lazy OTO people who can't get anything done and are boring and not interested in the material. Who wants to hang out with those people? I don't want to hang out with them.
They have nothing interesting to say or do.
No, they have nothing interesting to offer. And that's the problem. We're not opposed to a party. We just want a party with people who know how to party well. And knowing how to party well involves, I think, being intelligent, being interesting, and having something to share and having something to contribute. So, again, people, if they go back to the original material and really ask themselves, if I took this seriously, what would this mean? They will find the transgressive elements there for themselves. You and I won't have to tell them what they are. But I will say that if you identify the values of middle-class life in America as it's lived right now and start applying Thelema to it rigorously, you'll see there's a lot of transgression there. There's more than enough to keep people occupied.
All right, well, I think that's a good place to stop. So thank you again for being on the podcast, and 93.
93, John, thanks for having me.
The last interview I have is with Stephen Skinner. The sound quality is not the best. Stephen Skinner lives in Asia, so he and I had a long-distance call, literally halfway across the globe, and so the sound is not the best, but I still think the interview is well worth dealing with the sound. He's full of information. His background talks about the books, what has come out through Golden Horde, how the Magician's Companion came together, and then also he talks about the next book that's going to be coming out through Golden Horde. So here's Stephen Skinner.
We have on the phone with us Stephen Skinner. Welcome to the podcast, Stephen.
Hi, John.
For those who are not aware, you've been in magic and magical practice and writing about magic for over 30 years. How did you get into the practice of magic?
Well, in fact, I've been involved in magic since the early 60s, and originally I got involved with a group which was doing tarot studies in Sydney, and that led very rapidly to initiation into a working lodge there. And so I was lucky to have been involved before I was 16, in fact.
So you have been practicing magic since you were 16?
Yep. In fact, I also managed to get to university before I was when I was 16 as well. So I guess I was a bit precocious in those days.
It would seem so. Now, your first book on magic, how did that come about?
Well, the very first one I did was called Search for Abraxas, and that was done with Neville Drury. And Neville just came across to London and was looking for a publisher, and he found Neville Spearman. And I think Neville Spearman, just more or less to get rid of us, said, "Oh, if you can write the book in a month or so, I'll publish it," thinking we couldn't do that. So he sat down and did that, and then he had to honor his promise. So that was the first book. But I suppose the one that's most known is Techniques of High Magic, which I did with Francis King in the 1970s.
How did you get introduced to Francis King and work on that magic book?
Well, I was brought up in Sydney. Francis lived in London. When I first came to London, by that time, I guess it was through mutual acquaintances. In fact, I think it was Stuart Farrer who introduced me to Francis first off, and we got on quite well and decided to do, in fact, a couple of books together. Francis, alas, has now passed on. Unfortunately, he never wrote an autobiography, which would have been one of the more amusing books about magic.
Right. Now, are you a practicing magician, or do you go towards more a pagan or witchcraft path?
No, magic has always been my interest.
Okay.
I'd like to draw a bit of a line there. Paganism is fine, but is concerned perhaps more with religious practice, because you're dealing just with the gods. Witchcraft, modern witchcraft, came into prominence with Gerald Brusso Gardner and Cecil Williamson during the 40s and 50s. And although I've known most of the people like Alexander's who were involved in propagating that, I never got actively involved myself. My interest has been more of the medieval ceremonial and grimoire magic.
How did you get involved with Feng Shui, since you've written 20-some books about it?
There are two answers to that. The one I usually give is that I had a friend who had a legal practice in Hong Kong, and his practice needs a little bit of help. And jokingly, I think he went off and got a feng shui man to help reorganize his office. And so I met that feng shui master way back in the mid-70s and learned the practical side of feng shui before I ever understood the theory of it. So I suppose I learned my feng shui backwards. The other route leading into that was actually a spin-off from Techniques of High Magic, where I did a couple of books on geomancy. Geomancy, as most people listening to this will know, is a Western and Arabic form of divination using dots tied to the earth, but some unfortunate missionary in the late 1870s used the word geomancy to translate the word feng shui out of Chinese. And so when I was working on those books on geomancy, I came across a lot of feng shui and 19th century books, and I got fascinated. And then the two things came together because my profession originally was geography lecturer, so I was fascinated that utilizing the geography of the land, you could actually alter the fortunes of people living in the houses there. So all those three strands came together, and that's why my interest in feng shui.
Now, feng shui is about the movement of the qi. How do you think those concepts of energy movement mesh with the concepts of energy manipulation and magic? Do you think there's a lot of overlap there?
Yes and no. Feng Shui deals with fairly concrete forces. Qi is something which I think it's only a matter of time before it'll be measurable in some way or another. You can get pretty predictable Feng Shui results by doing just specific formulaic things. My view on magic, however, is that you are dealing not with abstract forces, but you're dealing with entities. And these entities are a lot more individual than the energy that Feng Shui deals with.
So you're saying that you see the angels or demons or however they're described, these entities, as definitive, external, discrete units versus the idea of their psychological projections.
No. I don't buy the psychological projection for various reasons, to a large extent from practical experience. But also because the idea that they are psychological projections was probably started by Crowley as a way of justifying his work with the Goetia. In fact, I think in his introduction to Goetia, he even suggests that they're parts of the brain, which is something I don't think anybody would think now. And then psychology, particularly in the works of Carl Jung, seized upon mythology and alchemy and other related technologies and started to interpret them in a psychological way. However, my take on what I like to call spiritual creatures, that is, entities like demons, angels, nature spirits, is that they do have a discrete existence, and they have been labeled at various stages in the history by, I suppose, predominantly Christian commentators. So that, for example, to draw a parallel, if you visited the zoo and you were looking at animals you'd never seen before, you might categorize the contents of the snake house as rather demonic and the contents of the aviary perhaps as angelic. But basically, you are still looking at individual animals, which I suppose in a weird sort of way, I think that Dee's description of them as spiritual creatures and his assertion, which I find to be quite true, that you can't always tell the difference between a demon impersonating an angel and an angel, is uncomfortable and difficult, but basically correct.
Well,
I don't know whether that makes enough sense. But,
no, I think that's fine. Let's move into your more recent publications with Golden Horde. Now, you have 3 books with Golden Horde so far. The first came out a few years ago. It was one that you also wrote with David Rankin?
Yes.
And that was called The Practical Angel Magic of Dr. John Dee's Enochian Tables. Why did you start with that book?
Well, for those of you who know my history, you'll know that I've always been interested in Dee's work. And in fact, in the early 70s, I spent almost an entire year just reading all of his original manuscripts in the Bodleian and the British Museum, as it was called then, but now it's called the British Library. And I constructed a synthesis of that, of all of that work, which unfortunately was never published for other complicated reasons. But one of the bits that I didn't work on then was the 17th century development of Dee's work. In other words, after Dee died in 1608, what actually happened to his invocations and his systems of magic. Well, normally these days most people think that they just popped up again when Masses did the research for the Golden Dawn. But in fact there's a definitive hand-me-down structure of ritual angelic magicians working with these entities over the period of the 1600s right through the 1700s and into the 1800s. And it's in the 1800s that workers like Fred Hockley got hold of this material, and then some of it, but only a portion of it, came into the Golden Dawn. Hockley was very strong on scrying and using the crystal. So this tradition is quite solid, and I named in that book the the various magicians who handed on from one to the next, and they were quite prominent people in their own right.